You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Good morning, Dolphins, and welcome to episode 22 of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4, and you can follow along with the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker. We've covered a lot of ground in the past couple weeks doing the Catching Buffalo series, and thank you to everybody who tuned in to those podcasts and read the article posted on DolphinsTalk.com last week. For me, being a football nerd, it was a pretty, interesting project to kind of take on myself and just see how much more ground the Dolphins need to go to catch the Buffalo Bills. So thank you for that, and thank you for following along. We've officially entered into the summer doldrums period of the NFL season. There's really nothing going on football-wise between now and the start of training camps at the end of July. We may see a couple of transactions, players getting extensions, possibly some players moved, but it's a relatively quiet period, and that's just the way my unofficial co-host Chloe likes it. She is asleep here on the floor next to me. So if you do hear a snoring-like sound, please remember that it is her and not me. Now, I don't really have a lot, planned out for this episode. Normally, I at least kind of type up some notes and some bullet points for things that I want to cover on the podcast. But today, I'm just going to kind of leave it open-ended. Normally, I don't like to get into the rumor business and things like that, but obviously the talk of Dolphins Twitter and the sites that I visit the past few days has been about the Jason Lockhan 4 article, which I think came out Thursday or Friday this past week, and basically stated that if the Dolphins regress this year, Brian Flores might find himself on the hot seat. And, it's a bit of a prickly subject, and I know Jason Lockhan 4 kind of has a bit of a reputation amongst Dolphins fans, although I would remind everybody that he was indeed correct, saying that the Dolphins would get rid of Ndamukong Suh the offseason in which they did. So just keep that in mind. These reporters have reliable sources, and things do get passed around NFL media from scouts, agents, players, people associated with players. Even if the team wants something, bottled up, it doesn't always stay that way. And I won't get into the whole backstory of what I know about the situation, but I wanted to just kind of acknowledge two parallels here. If you think about when Brian Flores was hired, it was fresh off of a Super Bowl win with the Patriots, officially hired in 2019, and signed a 5-year contract. Most NFL coaches on their first deals get 4 years. And I think the reason that he got a 5th year was because the team knew that they finally had to rebuild and tear it down and do this right. And I think that effort, was driven mostly by Chris Greer and convincing Stephen Ross that it's high time to do this. They had been through so many Band-Aid approach off seasons and so many years where, we're just a couple of players away under Jeff Ireland and Mike Tannenbaum, who are the only, general managers and executive vice presidents that Stephen Ross had known to that point. And when Chris Greer took over the seat, he said, I'm going to break this thing down, tear it down, we're going to build it up, the right way and rebuild through the draft and collect all these assets. And by and large, the Dolphins have done that. They've built through the draft. They've added pieces in free agency. But you have to acknowledge that 2019 was a throwaway year, and I know not to bring up the whole tank for Tua narrative and all that. Let's make a clear distinction here. The coaching staff and the players that were on the field for those games in 2019 were trying their damnedest to win the games. The front office strategically made it so that the players that they were bringing in were not capable of measuring up to most NFL rosters. And I think that's where you see a lot of the accolades from, people around the league about Brian Flores is he squeezed 5 wins out of that roster when many going into the season, myself included, thought that, maybe 2 wins was the ceiling. It was a bad roster, and we won 5 games that year and beat some impressive teams, in my opinion, that season. But I think essentially that's a throwaway year. And really, because of that, I kind of view 2020 as year 1 for Brian Flores. Now, to go 10-6, I think was a little bit of an overachievement. I thought, 8-8, 9-7 was about where the Dolphins should land. And they won 10 games despite COVID, despite having 3 rookies on the offensive line for the majority of the season, despite shifting to Tua Tagovailoa probably earlier than they would have liked, and him not being 100%. Despite all of this, for more than a third of the season, they had the number 1 scoring defense in the league. They had an offense that produced a top 10 amount of points in the franchise's history, which is pretty incredible when you think about some of the quarterbacks and offenses that have been here in Miami. But if you view that as year 1, because 2019 was sort of that throwaway, tear-down year, going 10-6 in a coach's first year creates expectations. Look at, I guess, really the 3 previous coaches to Brian Flores, full-time coaches. Tony Sparano goes 11-5 his first year, wins the division, and makes the playoffs. What happens in year 2? Well, expectations got raised. And, if you think about that 2008 season, Miami beat a bunch of really bad teams, the Raiders, the Seahawks, the Rams, the Bills that year. They beat a bunch of really bad teams in some really close games. They only beat a couple teams that actually had, playoff resumes or were close to the playoffs, namely the Patriots, the Chargers, which got them into the playoffs with the tiebreaker, and they beat the Jets in the finale. But they weren't really an 11-5 good team coming into the next year, and Tony Soprano never made the playoffs again in his tenure as the Dolphins coach. He's gone. Joe Philbin, I forgot he was in this mix, but, he didn't have that awesome first year the way Sparano did. Let's look at Adam Gase. He goes 10-6 his first year, makes it to the playoffs. The defense was depleted by injuries throughout the course of the season to the point where, at the end of the year, you had to start Bakari Rambo as a safety in your defense. I mean, that's how bad things got. And things kind of fell apart. Tannehill got injured. But everyone kind of assumed that, okay, Gase is the real deal. Going into 2017, Tannehill's going to come back and we're going to be a playoff team. And obviously that didn't happen, and Tannehill messed up his knee again in training camp, and we had the Jay Cutler era of the Miami Dolphins that lasted all of one season. And I think back to Nick Saban. If you guys remember that year, Miami started off 3-7 and then got red hot and won 6 games in a row. They made all the big offseason additions that year, and I believe it was Sports Illustrated even predicted the Dolphins would make it to the Super Bowl with Dante Culpepper. You can rehash that situation as much as you like, but when they brought in Dante, expectations were heightened. Had the shoe been on the other foot and they brought in Drew Brees, I would imagine the expectations would still have been heightened going in from year 1 to year 2. So back to the present day with Brian Flores. You look at what he's done, and, going 10-6 last year, having them on the precipice of the playoffs was pretty impressive, in my opinion, given the roster they had and the circumstances of last year. And what has happened now is expectations have been heightened. And I think where this article, where its rubber meets the road, so to speak, is you have to look at how Miami's gotten here. And you look at some of the decisions they've made. They've given some big money to players like Kyle Van Noy, who, while they did structure the contract to have an easy out, you kind of wonder, why did they offer to pay him all this money if they were going to jettison him? You look at paying Eric Flowers $10 million a year and getting rid of him after one season. Not that, we're knocking Eric Flowers, but, someone had to sign off on this free agent signing. Shaq Lawson got a contract for 3 years and I think $10 million a year, which probably should have gone to Emmanuel Ogbah instead of Shaq Lawson. If you would flip those two's contracts, I think we'd be in a pretty nice situation right now. But Shaq Lawson gets traded, a year into the deal for Bernardrick McKinney, who was a piece that they tried to get when they were trying to trade Laramie Tunsil. And when those negotiations with the Texans were starting. So, we're at the point now where you've built up that foundation of that house, the metaphorical house. And you're at the point now where, you sort of remodeled the kitchen twice in 2 years. On top of that, you look at some of the offensive staff decisions, and I think there are justifications for those. Jim Caldwell was hired in, stepped away for health reasons. You can't really control that. But Chad O'Shea came in. There's a whole backstory about why he was removed, and I am not allowed to share that here. But just know, I think the team made the right decision in doing that. And then I think clearly they hired Chan Gailey to be Ryan Fitzpatrick's offensive coordinator. If you remember last year, Miami's bye week, I think, was originally week 12 or week 13. And their schedule got adjusted because the NFL needed to, get the Patriots-Broncos game scheduled. And Miami and Denver had the same bye, so they were able to rework some things. And Miami's bye got moved up. I would bet dollars to donuts that Miami's plan last year never really included Tua until they got through that late bye. And it was going to be a case of, okay, if we're still in playoff contention, let's ride with Fitz the rest of the way. If we're not, then we'll give Tua, kind of an early audition, and 2021 would be like the first full year of Tua. Well, we ended up getting 9 games out of Tua last year, and I don't necessarily think that's what the Dolphins originally intended to do, but it worked, and they almost made it to the playoffs. And we saw, despite everything going on, despite having an offensive coordinator that maybe wasn't best suited to have a young quarterback like Tua, despite having some personnel limitations. You think back to that Kansas City game, you didn't have Myles Gaskin, you didn't have Savon Ahmed, Jakeem Grant and Devontae Parker both get injured in the first half. They still almost win it. You think back to that Denver game, and Vic Fangio, to his credit, is a great defensive mind and came up with a great plan to beat the Dolphins. Miami had their chances to make the playoffs, and I think they've sort of shortened their own runway a little bit. And because of that, that's why you start to see some of these rumors about the Deshaun Watson scenario kind of come into play. I think that's why you kind of see, okay, Tua's got to hit it big this year because they've got 2 first-round picks sitting there in 2023, which I would imagine is going to end up being a better college quarterback class than what we're going to have in the 2022 draft. I mean, these things are they're that speeding train that's coming at you in the dark tunnel. That light's coming, and you just better hope it's coming slowly and you're able to meet those expectations and find a way out of that tunnel and off of that runway, before it gets there. Because I do think there's going to be some ramifications if they go 5-12 this year. That would not be a step forward. That would not be progress. And they've spent a pretty good deal in terms of resources trying to fix up certain things. But I think as fans, we sometimes forget that the NFL is very much a performance and results-based business. And when you go through all these different iterations of moving different players and spending big money only to see it go out the window, that can ruffle some feathers within ownership. Because while, you're not necessarily losing money, but you're still spending money in a manner that may not be as responsible as it should be or that your ownership would approve of. And I think that's where the whole Jason La Canfora thing comes into play is, if this season goes completely sideways and the Dolphins take a major step back, I think there's going to be some hard questions from Mr. Ross that get asked to Chris Grier and Brian Flores, and that runway that you have, which I talked about earlier this year, that kind of 3-year window when you've got a large portion of the core of this team all under contract. I think that runway starts to kind of get chewed up a little bit, and you're going to, kind of increase the rapidity of the decisions that you have to make on your timeline as far as building a winner. So that's where I think the piece is coming from, and I think, we as Dolphins fans on Twitter tend to overreact and knee-jerk react to most things. But if you really sit down and read the actual words that, if there is no progress, he could be on the hot seat, implying next year, I think that's pretty well within bounds, And I would say, too, to get where the Dolphins want to go, which is to ultimately win the AFC East, build a perennial playoff and Super Bowl contender, shouldn't there be expectations? I mean, for far too long, we've been in this mediocre realm, really since I graduated high school. The Dolphins have not been relevant in the National Football League. I'm 35 years old. That's almost half of my life at this point. They have largely been irrelevant. So, I think it's time to increase our expectations as fans. Having said all of this so far in the first 15 minutes of this podcast, as many of you know, if you've read some of my articles, I did have the opportunity to go down and cover a game live during that 2019 season. It was the home finale, the overtime win over the Bengals. And while I didn't get to meet and shake Brian Flores' hand, I got to be in the same room with him and listen to his post-game media availability. And I got to talk to all of the beat writers, the Omar Kellys, the Adam Beasleys, everyone that you've read, Safed Dean, Cameron Wolf from ESPN. They were all very, very, very impressed with Brian Flores, and you couldn't find a single person within the Dolphins organization that I interacted that day that didn't have something great to say about him and the direction that this team was heading. I think there's still a lot of very strong belief that Miami got the right hire in terms of Brian Flores. And I have very little doubt in my mind that he's going to go out and make the Dolphins a playoff team in 2021. The only way I don't see that happening is if you just have a rash of catastrophic injuries to the defense, or Tua Tagovailoa, just isn't the guy. And I'm on record thinking, I've said it on the podcast, I think he's going to be really good in this league. I don't know that he's ever going to be top 5 or top 3 good, but I think he's going to be really good, and he's a guy that you can win and win big with. I just don't know that he's going to be able to be that transcendent talent like an Aaron Rodgers or a Patrick Mahomes or a Tom Brady or a Dan Marino. I don't think that's him. But I think he's capable of taking the Dolphins to where they want to go. So all that said, we're in the summer doldrums, and obviously people are going to get their feathers ruffled a bit, or maybe their flippers in a tizzy. I don't know what the right dolphin mammal analogy is there. But guys, it's July. There's still... it's not even July. I spoke to a week too soon. We're almost to July 4th weekend, and there's a lot of things that are going to transpire between now and the start of training camp. There's things that are going to transpire between now and the start of the season. There's going to be things that happen in the season, which, by the way, if you guys ever would want to meet up, I guarantee I will be at the Bengals preseason game, the third preseason game. I will be there. I will be at the game in Nashville against the Titans, and I am planning a trip down to Miami. I have that narrowed down to 2 games. I'll probably have that figured out by the time I record the next episode. and let you guys know. But would love to meet and interact with as many Dolph fans as possible while I'm at those games. Back to this season for the rest of the show, and we'll keep it a bit of a brief episode today. If Miami's going to make the jump that I think they're going to make as a team this year and become a playoff team, there's going to be guys that are going to make some impact. And I really wanted to focus on, I guess, 3 guys that I think are going to be especially key for the Dolphins that maybe fly a little bit under the radar in terms of, how the fan base views them. Some of them are big names, some of them are not. But I think these guys are guys that are going to have important pieces or important roles on this team. I've got 3 on offense, 3 on defense, and I'll just talk about them briefly to kind of wrap up this week's episode. On offense, the 3 I picked were running back Malcolm Brown, wide receiver Will Fuller, and tackle Liam Eichenberg. Now, with Malcolm Brown, you look at what he did really well for the Rams last year, and that was to be basically a red zone goal line runner. And for being 225 pounds, he was a pretty good pass catching option as a third down back. And I think he's going to be more dynamic than what we got out of Patrick Laird last year. And I think he's going to pick up, hidden yardage. You watch what the Rams did last year with him, and there were a lot of times where he would kind of, sit there, either fake like he was going to stay in and pass protect, or run a delayed little route to the flat to whichever side was open, and Jared Goff would hit him, and he'd, pick up yards after the catch. It's an easy throw, and I think that's something that is probably a focus of Tua Tagovailoa's to improve on from year 1 to year 2. And I just think that Malcolm Brown is a nice little weapon in that regard, and can also be kind of that hammer back you want around the goal line. Take nothing away from Myles Gaskin and Savon Ahmed. I thought they were both pretty successful in the opportunities they had to run in the goal line situations and goal-to-go situations. But I think Malcolm Brown gives you a little bit more flexibility with how you can go about executing your goal line offense. Now, Will Fuller comes over, and he won't play in week 1 against the New England Patriots, still serving that final game of a suspension. But would it really surprise people if he ended up being the top receiver for the Dolphins this year? You watch what he did last year for the Texans, who were pretty bad, a 4-12 team. But he's such a great route runner. He's able to stack guys and get past them. That old expression you hear on the games, if the receiver's even, he's leaving. That applies to Will Fuller. And I was very impressed when I did my breakdown of Will Fuller earlier this season with the amount of routes he's able to run and the variety of moves he's able to use to get open. He's pretty good with his hands for a receiver that's not all that big. He's listed at 184 pounds. He has some pretty subtle head fakes and body fakes that are built into his releases. Even though he's got tremendous straight line speed, you don't always see those two things marry up. So I think Will Fuller, number 1, gives you sort of that foil opposite Devontae Parker on the outside, and still gives you some flexibility to move him around the formation, put him in motion, put him in stacked releases. You can do a number of different things with him. But I think he's that type of guy who, not only can stretch your defense vertically, but can help you stretch it horizontally. And I really look at the big 4 receiving names, Fuller, Parker, Waddle, Gesicki, and think that, Miami's done an awful lot to kind of gear this offense towards what Tua Tagovailoa is good at. And, not that there's increased pressure on Tua, because he's a quarterback in the NFL. There's always going to be that pressure. But I think we'll know pretty quickly whether Tua's got the goods or not. And I think he does. But I think Will Fuller is going to play a larger part in the offense than maybe many people expect. And then third is Liam Eichenberg. I did some late night tweeting the other night and watched some Liam Eichenberg stuff, and that tweet kind of blew up. And just watching his game, and I'll basically restate my tweet here. He doesn't have the sweet feet and the elite athleticism that Laramie Tunsil had. He doesn't have that power and nastiness in the run game, and even in pass pro, that Jake Long had. But he's just so technically proficient. He just gets his job done. He's able to get in the way as a run blocker and can do some things on the second level. In terms of pass pro, he doesn't have the longest arms, but his technique is good. He times his punch pretty well. Sometimes he's almost too patient, which you can teach him to be more aggressive and do jump sets and things of that nature. But now you're asking him to move from left tackle, which he played at Notre Dame, to right tackle. You're asking him to be Tua Tagovailoa's backside protector. That's a pretty big role to put on a rookie. And especially with the position change, being a part of that role. So I think if he comes in and does well, that's going to mean good things for the offense and good things for Tua, because the last thing you want to have to worry about as a quarterback is getting hit by what you can't see. And I think Liam Eichenberg can go a long way in helping to prevent that. So those three guys, Malcolm Brown, Will Fuller, Liam Eichenberg, are three guys I want to watch on offense. On the defensive side of the football, I've talked about Zach Sealer ad nauseum, but you could probably add Tim to this list as well, as I think he's going to get a lot more time at defensive end in four-man lines than people think. But the three I'm going to go with here, a little bit bigger names, would be Christian Wilkins, Benardrick McKinney, and Javon Holland. With Christian Wilkins, I loved the pick when he came out of Clemson, but people are always going to compare him to Jeffrey Simmons and see that he doesn't quite have the flashy numbers in terms of sacks and things that Jeffrey Simmons does. Simmons was picked by the Titans, I think 5 picks later, 18th overall, if I remember correctly. Well, Wilkins has been a pretty good run defender in his time here in Miami, and I think he was top 5 in the league last year in terms of defensive tackle win rate against the run. But you just watch him play. He does so many little things that help other people. He's great in the twist games. He's got his hand on footballs and deflected several passes last year. You think back to that Week 1 game against New England. He was everywhere. And if we can get that on a more consistent basis and have that dominant interior player, which I think Christian Wilkins is fully capable of being, that's going to go a long way in boosting the defense. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about Christian Wilkins here at the very end. Number 2 was Benardrick McKinney. I think he's going to have a very interesting role, and I don't necessarily know what that's going to be. But I think part of it is going to be a direct replacement for Kyle Van Noy. I don't know if he'll play on the edge as much as Kyle Van Noy did last year, but I would encourage you to watch how Brian Flores used Kyle Van Noy when he was the unofficial defensive coordinator of the Patriots in 2018. Van Noy played off the ball in an inside linebacker role something like 44-45% of the time. That's what Benardrick McKinney has historically played. And I think we'll see him and Jerome Baker on the field quite a bit together. And I think there's going to be situations where we see Benardrick McKinney play on the edge. Perhaps in those jack fronts where you have 3 down linemen basically playing tight techniques with Andrew Van Ginkel and McKinney on the edges, and then either Baker or Elandon Roberts playing that protected middle linebacker role. Miami interchanged that a lot last year on down and distance, but McKinney has always been a very good run defender. He's been a great player in terms of the goal line. He can do a couple things, in limited pass coverage responsibilities. And I think you're going to see him add sort of an edge defender to his repertoire this year. And we'll have to see how that goes, because during his time in Houston, I thought he was more of a finesse edge, run around type of player than rather, setting a hard edge and playing through people the way Kyle Van Noy did. So it'll be interesting to see how Miami counteracts that. I do think part of the solution will be playing more 4-man defensive lines, and you can let McKinney and Baker be the 2 off-ball defenders. Maybe you see Andrew Van Ginkel's snaps take a slight dip in those 4-man formations when he was playing end last year, now that Jalen Phillips is in the fold, You may not have to rely on Van Ginkel in those four-man line sets as much, but maybe you see Van Ginkel play more in some of those odd Mac-O formations. Maybe you see him play more, as as a strong side linebacker and an over front. He and Zach Sealer formed a pretty nice tandem together as a right D-end and right edge linebacker last year towards the end of the season. Benardrick McKinney coming in allows you to do those types of things and give you that flexibility to run more four-man fronts, which is what the 2018 Patriots did and got to a Super Bowl doing. So Benardrick McKinney, I think, is a pretty key player in terms of what the defensive flexibility ends up being. And the final one is Jevon Holland. Now, odds are, because of the release of Bobby McCain, they have him pegged to replace Bobby McCain in that middle-of-the-field free safety type role. Jevon Holland did do some of that at Oregon, predominantly in his freshman year in 2018, and did some more of it, albeit disguised looks or late rotations in 2019. He was more of a slot defender. And initially when I first watched him, I thought, this is Chauncey Gardner-Johnson part 2. But I think Miami has designs on him being that middle-of-the-field free safety. And I do know a couple people who were at minicamp, and they told me that he looked pretty darn athletic and good in terms of his movement. So I'm very curious to see how he ends up in that role. Obviously a better athlete coming out if you look at the testing metrics than Bobby McCain was. So, I think he's more of a closer, player comp from a physical standpoint to Devin McCourty than what Bobby McCain was. But mastering this defense, being that main communicator, being able to change things up on the fly as a rookie doesn't always go that smoothly. And I wonder how much influence Jason McCourty will have, and I wonder if Jason McCourty ends up starting a couple games early in the season just because he's more familiar with the defense. So Jevon Holland's, arc to that starting role, how long does it take him to get there? Is he able to get that spot right off the bat, and is he able to thrive being that communicator? We have no way of knowing that, but he seems like a very sharp guy and a very smart guy in some of the off-the-field stuff I've seen and some of the features from the draft coverage that NFL.com did. Hopefully he's able to take to that role, because I think having that extra athleticism back there could be a huge boost to the secondary. You look no further than what Buffalo did to Miami in Week 17 for your examples as to why I think Miami wanted to upgrade that spot, and also brought in extra players who can play in the slot. You don't want to get beat by Isaiah McKenzie, the way Miami did in Week 17. So, those are the three players on defense: Christian Wilkins, Benardrick McKinney, Jevon Holland. I think if those three guys have good years, this defense can take another jump forward from where it left off a year ago. I truly believe that. I think this defense can be elite, and they were sort of hitting that ceiling last year. Now they need to push through it. A couple of things before we sign off for this week's episode. First of all, number one, there will be no episode on July 4th weekend. I've got some family coming into town where my wife and I live in Indiana. There's a lot of big 4th of July celebrations, and it's just going to be kind of controlled chaos at our house, and I won't have time to really record the episode. But we will pick back up after that. Second, I'm working on 2 new written pieces for DolphinsTalk.com. One of them is going to be kind of a feature on Christian Wilkins. I'm kind of slowly working through and hope to have that up sometime, once training camp starts. The other one is something I'm going to call Project Third Down. And you'll see me tweet about that, here coming up in the next couple weeks. But I am looking for someone to be a great Dolphin and volunteer to help me put together a few video cut-ups for that. I myself don't have much editing experience, so if you or someone you know might be interested, please have them get in touch with me on Twitter. Send me a DM. My handle is at KevinMD4. So KevinMD4. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for reading all of the articles. Just remember, we're all in this together. We're all fans of the same team. We all want the same thing. Expectations should be high. But I also think that Miami has a lot of pieces in place, and Brian Flores is chief among them in delivering upon those expectations. That's how I feel about things. And I think we're in for a fun season ahead this fall and this winter. Again, if you guys want to meet up, I will be at the Bengals preseason game, and I will be at the Titans game in Nashville during the regular season. I will be making a trip to Miami. I have not yet figured out which home game that'll be. It'll likely be either the Giants or the Panthers games, which are at the end of November and the beginning of December. I hope to be able to announce that on my next episode, which will be after July 4th weekend. So would love to meet as many Dolphins fans as I can and interact with you guys. You know, might have a couple other friends down there that might be out with us as well. So again, thank you guys for listening. Since I won't speak to you until after, please have a happy and safe 4th of July. Fins up.